Let's do our predictions for the week, this Thanksgiving week, for the College Football Committee's top 25. This week will be a little easier to predict than last week. I did get 24 of 25 teams right again last week. The team that I missed was Houston, and I kind of thought that would be the team I missed. Uh, I did not get as many teams in the correct position as I did the week before. There was a bit more turmoil last week. This week was very stable. I'm predicting that all 25 of the teams from last week will again be the 25 teams this week. The only team that I could see possibly falling out of the top 25 is Arkansas, and I'll go ahead and start with them. Arkansas lost, but they played Alabama well at Tuscaloosa. So even though they're 7-4, I think they will stay in the top 25 at the 25th spot. Now, if they do drop out, the team that should replace them, I think, would be Clemson. Clemson has not been in the top 25 all year. They've quietly been getting themselves back together. So Clemson could be there. I'm usually one team off. If that's the team this week, then that will be who replaces Arkansas. But I think Arkansas will remain in the top 25. Mississippi State will be 24th, I believe. They have a game coming up this week against Ole Miss on Thanksgiving night. And that game could be important as far as the Sugar Bowl is concerned, depending upon what happens elsewhere. Houston, 23rd. They have now clinched the AAC championship game. They will go up against Cincinnati. Both Houston and Cincinnati are undefeated in conference. The game will be played at Cincinnati if Cincinnati wins their last game. If Cincinnati were to lose, then the game will be played at Houston. So that's going to be an important game, as it turns out, because of what happened this weekend. San Antonio remains undefeated. They won their game on the last play of the game. They will be going to the Conference USA Championship game. They have one more regular season game, as does everyone. And they will go to the Conference USA Championship game against either Western Kentucky and Marshall. Those two teams are playing each other this Saturday. The winner goes up against San Antonio. That conference championship game will be played in San Antonio. North Carolina State is at 21st. North Carolina State is not entirely out of the ACC conference championship picture. In fact, I would say they've got a pretty decent shot of making it. They need help. They have to win their game against North Carolina, and then they need help. And so I'll talk about the help here in a minute. They have the advantage over Clemson. Clemson still has a chance to get in that too, but North Carolina State beat Clemson, so they have the advantage over Clemson. In order for Clemson to get in, North Carolina State would have to lose. At 20th, San Diego State had another close win. They have not clinched a spot in the Mountain West Conference championship game yet. They have to beat Boise State this week to do that, or have Fresno State lose. If that situation reverses, then Fresno State goes and San Diego State comes in second in their division. The other division in the Mountain West, the Mountain Division, is wide open. 3 teams are tied for first: Utah State, Air Force, and Boise State. So I won't even go into the possibilities there. We'll just have to wait and see what happens. Wake Forest getting beat pretty soundly by Clemson drops them to 19th. They still have their fate in their hands as far as the ACC championship game goes. If they win, they're in. If they lose, that opens the door for North Carolina State. If North Carolina State were to win, then they would be in. But if they were to lose, that opens the door for Clemson. So there's your possibilities. For Utah, very convincing, very good win against Oregon. Definitely the playoff consequential game of the week. Utah now has clinched the South Division of the Pac-12 and will go to that game. We still don't know who wins the North yet. We'll go over that in just a minute. Pittsburgh clinched the ACC championship game this week. I think they'll be 17th. And Pittsburgh they're not a great team, but they're fun to watch actually, and they play with a lot of heart. They give it their all, and they're a fun team to watch. So I'm rooting for them. It's good to see these teams that used to be powerhouses that have kind of faded over time start to reemerge again. I always like to see that. Iowa is still in the hunt for the Big Ten West, coming in at 16th. Although they need help, they will be the favorite to win their game this week. Texas A&M, coming in at 15th, still has the Sugar Bowl as a possibility, depending on what happens. 14th, Wisconsin has the inside track for the Big Ten championship game. All they have to do is win their game. They're going to play at Minnesota, so that's not a given. If they lose, that opens the door for Iowa. If Iowa wins, then they're in that case. If they both were to lose, that opens the door for a lot of things. It's hard to say. Minnesota, Purdue, several teams come into play at that point. BYU continues to just chug along, winning. They're 13. Michigan State really got crushed by Ohio State. I think they will drop to 12th. They're still in the hunt potentially for a Tier 1 New Year's Six bowl game kind of thing. They probably have played themselves into the Citrus Bowl or the Outback Bowl at this point, but we'll see. Oklahoma still only has one loss. They still can definitely make the Big 12 championship game. The committee has not been impressed with them. Frankly, neither have I. Here's the thing. I think Oklahoma State is definitely the better team. The game this week is at Oklahoma State. So Oklahoma State should win. More on that in a second. Ole Miss, I think, moves up to 10th. They are definitely in a good spot to go to the Sugar Bowl, depending upon what happens with Alabama. Of course, Ole Miss has to beat Mississippi State first, so we'll see about that. Baylor is in a good position now to make the Big 12 championship game. They still have 2 losses. I don't see them being a playoff contender. But if Baylor wins their game and if Oklahoma State beats Oklahoma, then Baylor will go play Oklahoma State in the Big 12 championship game. And I think that will be a better game, actually, but we'll see. Oregon, convincing loss, I guess I could say, to Utah. Oregon still has not clinched the Pac-12 North. If they beat Oregon State, they have it. They can go get their revenge against Utah on a neutral field at that point. They probably will. They just did not respond well to playing in a hostile environment with a lot on the line, and they played themselves out of the playoffs as a result. They will not go to the playoffs, although the Rose Bowl is still there for their taking. Now to Oklahoma State, and now we get into the teams that still have a chance to make the playoffs. There are 7 of them. Oklahoma State is the first of the 7 that we'll talk about. Oklahoma State goes to the well, first of all, Oklahoma State has clinched a spot in the Big 12 championship game. Win or lose against Oklahoma, they're in the championship game. They should beat Oklahoma this week, but Oklahoma State has a history of losing this game, even when they should win it sometimes. They just have that complex, it seems like, against Oklahoma. So let's say they win. They will more than likely play Baylor in the Big 12 championship game. If they lose, they'll play Oklahoma. If they lose that game, if they lose one game, they're out. Okay, so they have to win to get in the playoffs. Their path is to beat Oklahoma, to win the Big 12 championship game, and then have a couple of other things happen that we'll talk about. Notre Dame is at 6th. They should end up with 1 loss. They do not have a conference championship game to play. They can get in, but they need help. So let's take a look at what has to happen. If Notre Dame loses their last game, they would be out. But let's just assume that's not going to happen. They're going to win. And they will be 11-1. Who is 5th? Michigan. This is going to be the big game this week. Michigan can still go to the Big 12 or the Big 10 championship game. They have to beat Ohio State at home. They are playing Ohio State at home. Can Harbaugh finally win the big game? it's kind of hard to see. Ohio State's playing really good right now, but Michigan is a good team. This team is different. They have a better attitude, I think, and Harbaugh seems to have finally maybe grown up a little bit as a head coach. Can they beat Ohio State? If they beat Ohio State, they take Ohio State's spot in the playoffs, and Ohio State drops out. That can happen. So Michigan State's path into the playoffs is clear. They beat Ohio State. They win the Big Ten championship game, and they are in. So it's a win and in deal for Michigan. They control their own fate. So does Cincinnati now. I don't see a combination of things that can knock Cincinnati out of the top four if Cincinnati wins their last game and then wins the AAC championship game. They have their fate in their hands now. Even if the committee is reluctant to put them in the fourth spot this week, let's say they jump Michigan ahead of Cincinnati, it really doesn't matter because Ohio State and Michigan are going to play each other. One of them are going to drop, and then Cincinnati's right there again. If Cincinnati wins, they are in. They have now secured that place for themselves. They had a good win against SMU. They control their own destiny. They also, to some extent, control Notre Dame's destiny because the committee is not going to put Notre Dame ahead of Cincinnati as long as Cincinnati keeps winning. From Notre Dame's perspective, if Cincinnati loses a game, that could be very bad for Notre Dame. Even though Notre Dame might move ahead of Cincinnati, that would still not look good for Notre Dame. Notre Dame needs Cincinnati to win, and Notre Dame basically drafts into the playoffs on Cincinnati behind them. So that's how Notre Dame wins their game. They get in ahead of the loser of the Ohio State-Michigan game, and they stay ahead of the Big 12 champion. That's going to be the tough part, I think, for Notre Dame. They don't have a championship game. They need Oklahoma State to lose because I think if Oklahoma State wins out, Oklahoma State will leapfrog Notre Dame. Then it's a question of who gets that other spot. Ohio State at third, definitely looking good for the playoffs. They still have to beat Michigan. They still have to win the Big Ten championship game. It is not a slam dunk for them, but if they control their own fate. If they win, they get in. And right now they're looking like the second best team, even though I think they'll be ranked third. Alabama will hold the second spot. Alabama too controls its fate, but I just don't trust Alabama at this point. First of all, they have to go to Auburn. Auburn's not playing well. Alabama should beat them, but Auburn has won 3 of the last 4 at Auburn against Alabama. Do not take that game for granted, even though Auburn is struggling. If Alabama does get by Auburn, that sets up the SEC championship game with Georgia. I just don't see Alabama beating Georgia. It's not because they're not talented enough. Alabama's probably still the most talented team in the country. They're not playing with a lot of heart. They just don't put their all into it. Georgia is in the playoffs. Again, I said this last week. They're going to beat Georgia Tech. They're probably going to beat Alabama too. I would be surprised. Alabama has to get on top of Georgia early and force Georgia into playing a game they don't like to play. That's how Alabama beats Georgia. But Alabama has to come ready to play at their best and play that way for the entire game to have that chance. If Alabama does that, then we can see them in the playoffs. So let's review who's in the playoffs. 17, you see Georgia, they're in. Alabama is in if they win out. If Alabama loses a game, I think they're out. I don't think they're going to the playoffs. Ohio State winning in now. Cincinnati is winning in. Michigan is winning in. Remember, Ohio State and Michigan have to play each other. The loser of that game is out. That allows Notre Dame a chance. Notre Dame should win their last game, but Notre Dame is not winning in. They need help. The help they need is for one of these two. Well, one of these two teams will obviously lose, and then they need Alabama knocked out to have a chance. But they also need Oklahoma State at 7. I think actually has a better chance than Notre Dame does. If Oklahoma State wins their games, they leapfrog Notre Dame. They'll be ahead of the loser of this game. That puts them in the 5th spot. And then if Alabama does stumble, which I expect Alabama to do, Oklahoma State could then move up into the fourth spot. I think if I had to put money on something right now, my playoff teams would be Georgia at first, Ohio State second, Cincinnati third, Oklahoma State fourth. I'll just go ahead and put that out there now. Oklahoma State has a history of choking in big games. They may very well do that again. But, we'll see. Those are the 7 teams that basically have a chance. Nobody else has a chance at this point. And I don't see any weird combination of things happening to give anybody else a chance at this point. I think it's these 7 teams on the screen right now. And oddly enough, I think number 7 is looking pretty good for the playoffs right now. Better than number 6, better than number 5, unless Michigan can beat Ohio State. And then Michigan at that point looks pretty good. So there's my predictions for the week. There's my predictions for the long term. We'll see what happens.